The desert sun beat down mercilessly as I stumbled through the endless expanse of sand and scrub brush, my elegant Boston dress torn to shreds, my throat parched beyond endurance. 3 days had passed since the stagecoach robbery that left me stranded in this godforsaken wilderness, and I was certain I would die here, another victim of the untamed West. My name is Catherine Ashford, and until that fateful morning, I had been the pampered daughter of a wealthy railroad baron, traveling to San Francisco to marry a man I'd never met, a business arrangement my father had orchestrated to secure his empire. Now, as I collapsed onto the burning sand, I wondered if my fate would be far worse than an arranged marriage. That's when I heard the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats approaching. Through my blurred vision, I saw him, a silhouette against the blazing sun, tall and imposing on his black stallion. As he dismounted and approached, I could make out rugged features shadowed by a worn Stetson, piercing green eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul, and a mouth set in a hard line that spoke of a man who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice like whiskey over gravel. "What do we have here? A little bird fallen from her nest?" I tried to speak, but only a croak emerged from my swollen throat. He knelt beside me, lifting a canteen to my lips with surprising gentleness. The water was like salvation itself, cool and life-giving. "Easy now," he murmured. "Too much too fast will make you sick." As my vision cleared, I got my first good look at my savior. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where it escaped his hat, sun-weathered skin that spoke of years under the open sky, and hands that were both strong and strangely elegant. There was something dangerous about him, something that made my pulse quicken even in my weakened state. "Thank you," I whispered. "I thought I was going to die." "You were," he said matter-of-factly. "Another few hours and you'd have been buzzard food." He studied me with those unsettling green eyes. "Name's Jake Morgan, and you are?" "Catherine Ashford." Something flickered across his face at the mention of my name, recognition perhaps, or calculation. "Ashford," he repeated slowly, as in Cornelius Ashford, the railroad king. I nodded weakly, and his expression hardened into something that made my blood run cold. "Well, Miss Ashford," he said, rising to his feet, "it seems fate has dealt me an interesting hand." Before I could ask what he meant, he scooped me up in his arms as if I weighed nothing and carried me to his horse. The contact sent an unexpected shock through my system. No man had ever held me so intimately, so possessively. "Where are you taking me?" I asked as he settled me in front of him on the saddle. "My ranch," he replied, his breath warm against my ear. "It's not much, but it'll keep you alive." The ride took several hours, during which I found myself becoming increasingly aware of the man behind me. His arms encircled me protectively, his chest solid and warm against my back. Despite my situation, I felt safer than I had in days. Jake's ranch was indeed modest, a small adobe house surrounded by corrals and outbuildings, with a few cattle grazing in the distance. But after days in the desert, it looked like paradise. He carried me inside and set me gently on a worn leather sofa. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade pieces that spoke of a man who valued function over form. Sunlight streamed through simple windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. "You need food and rest," Jake said, moving to the kitchen area. "We'll talk business once you're stronger." "Business?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Over the next few days, Jake nursed me back to health with surprising tenderness. He fed me simple but nourishing meals, changed the bandages on my cuts and scrapes, and even found me clean clothes, a simple cotton dress that belonged to someone from his past, though he wouldn't say who. As my strength returned, so did my curiosity about my enigmatic savior. I learned that he'd been a cavalry officer before settling on this remote ranch, that he'd lost his family in an Apache raid years earlier, and that he harbored a deep resentment toward the railroad companies that had carved up the territory, with little regard for the people already living there. "Your father's railroad destroyed 3 towns to lay his precious tracks," Jake told me one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Displaced hundreds of families, including mine." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "I didn't know," I said softly. "Course you didn't," he replied, but without malice. "Rich folks in their mansions never do." It was that night that Jake revealed the true nature of my situation. "I've been thinking about what to do with you, Miss Ashford," he said, his voice deceptively casual. "Your daddy would pay a handsome ransom for his precious daughter, I'm sure, but money can't give me back what I've lost." My heart began to pound. "What do you want?" Jake turned to face me, his green eyes glinting in the lamplight. "I want what your family took from me. A future. A legacy." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I want you to stay here and give me children." I stared at him in shock, my mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You can't be serious. Dead serious." His voice was low, dangerous. "You owe me your life, Catherine. I figure 3 children should about cover the debt." "You're insane." I jumped to my feet, my legs still shaky from my ordeal. "I won't be your broodmare." Jake rose slowly, his tall frame towering over me. "You will," he said quietly, "because the alternative is going back out into that desert, and next time, I won't be riding by to save you." The threat hung in the air between us, and I realized with growing horror that he meant every word. I was trapped, utterly at the mercy of this man who had saved my life only to claim it for his own purposes. That night I lay awake in the small bedroom Jake had given me, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But every plan I concocted seemed hopeless. I had no horse, no water, no knowledge of the terrain. And despite his ultimatum, Jake had shown me nothing but kindness and care. It was this contradiction that confused me most of all. The days that followed established a strange routine. Jake made no immediate moves to enforce his demands, instead treating me with the same careful attention he'd shown while nursing me back to health. We shared meals, conversation, and long silences that somehow felt companionable rather than awkward. I found myself studying him when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his hands moved with unconscious grace as he worked with his horses, the rare smile that transformed his harsh features, the gentleness he showed toward the injured animals he occasionally brought home to heal. "Why didn't you become a doctor?" I asked one afternoon as I watched him tend to a wounded coyote pup. Jake glanced up, surprised by the question. "War changes a man's plans," he said simply. It was during these quiet moments that I began to see past the bitter exterior to the man beneath. Jake Morgan wasn't a monster. He was a wounded soul who'd lost everything he'd ever cared about and was desperately trying to build something new from the ashes. That didn't make his demands any less outrageous, but it did make them more understandable. 3 weeks into my captivity, for that's what it was regardless of how gently I was treated, everything changed. I was helping Jake tend to his cattle when we heard the sound of approaching riders. A cloud of dust on the horizon resolved into a group of men wearing badges, led by a marshal I recognized from wanted posters as Tom Bradley, a man with a reputation for brutality. "Catherine Ashford," Bradley called out as his men surrounded us. "Your father's been looking for you." Relief flooded through me at the prospect of rescue, but it was tempered by an unexpected pang of, "What? Regret?" I glanced at Jake, whose face had gone stone cold. "I'm here, Marshal," I called back, stepping forward. Bradley dismounted, his hard eyes fixed on Jake. "And this must be the bastard who took you. Don't worry, miss. We'll see he hangs for what he's done." "Wait," I said quickly. "He saved my life. If not for him, I would have died in the desert. That so?" Bradley's smile was unpleasant. "Well, that was mighty kind of him. Course, kidnapping's still kidnapping regardless of how it started." I looked at Jake, expecting him to defend himself, to explain that he'd never actually harmed me. Instead, he stood silent, his hands loose at his sides, his face resigned. "String him up, boys," Bradley ordered. "No." The word tore from my throat with surprising force. "You can't." Bradley looked at me with amusement. "Stockholm Syndrome," he said to his men. "Happens sometimes when a woman's held captive too long. She starts thinking her captor's a good man." But as I watched Jake being roughly bound by the marshal's men, I realized with shocking clarity that my feelings had nothing to do with Stockholm Syndrome. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks I'd fallen in love with my captor. The revelation should have horrified me. Instead, it filled me with desperate determination. "Marshal Bradley," I said, drawing myself up to my full height and channeling every ounce of my father's commanding presence. "I am Catherine Ashford, daughter of Cornelius Ashford. This man is under my protection." Bradley paused, the noose in his hands. "Ma'am?" "Mr. Morgan saved my life and has treated me with nothing but respect and kindness," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Any harm that comes to him will be considered a personal affront to my family. Are you prepared to explain to my father why you murdered the man who saved his daughter's life?" The marshal's face went through several interesting color changes as he processed the implications of my words. The Ashford name carried weight even out here in the wilderness, and crossing my father was not a career move any lawman would make lightly. "But miss," Bradley said weakly, "the man kidnapped you." "Did he?" I moved to stand beside Jake, looking up into his startled green eyes. "Mr. Morgan, did you kidnap me?" Jake stared at me for a long moment, understanding passing between us. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I saved your life, and you agreed to stay on as my housekeeper until arrangements could be made for your safe return home." "Exactly," I said, turning back to the marshal. "A business arrangement between consenting adults." Bradley looked thoroughly confused. "But the ransom note—" "What ransom note?" I asked sharply. "The one demanding your father pay $50,000 for your safe return." I felt Jake tense beside me and my heart sank. Had I been wrong about him after all? "I never sent any ransom note," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "Course you didn't," Bradley scoffed. "One of your accomplices—" "I work alone," Jake interrupted. "Always have." A terrible possibility began to form in my mind. "Marshal," I said slowly, "who reported that I'd been kidnapped?" Bradley consulted a paper from his pocket. "Fellow named Silas Creek. Said he was a friend of the family. Happened to be in the area when the stage was robbed." Jake's face went white. "Silas Creek? You know him?" I asked. "He's my neighbor," Jake replied grimly. "Lives about 10 miles north, always been jealous of my ranch, wanted to buy me out." He looked at me with something like wonder in his eyes. "Catherine, I swear to you, I never sent any ransom note." The pieces began falling into place. "Marshal, where exactly did this robbery take place?" "About 15 miles southwest of Creek's ranch." "That's nearly 20 miles from where you found me," I said, looking at Jake. "Because Creek moved you," Jake said, his voice tight with anger. "Son of a bitch robbed the stage, took you to within a few miles of my ranch and left you to die. Probably figured the buzzards would clean up the evidence, and he could collect the ransom by claiming I was the kidnapper." The marshal was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Now hold on. Check for tracks, Jake said. You'll find at least 2 horses led my ranch from the southwest, Creek bringing her close enough to be found, then riding away. As Bradley's men began examining the ground, I felt a cold rage building inside me. Silas Creek had left me to die in the desert, banking on Jake finding me and being blamed for my disappearance. It was a plan that would have worked perfectly if not for one thing: Jake's unexpected demand for children instead of money. A demand that suddenly made perfect sense. You never intended to keep me as your broodmare, I said to Jake as the realization hit me. He had the grace to look embarrassed. I was angry, he admitted. When I realized who you were, all I could think about was what your father's railroad had done to my family. I wanted to hurt him the same way he'd hurt me. But you never would have gone through with it. Jake was quiet for a long moment. I told myself I would, he said finally. Right up until the moment I started caring more about your feelings than my own revenge. The marshal's men had found the tracks exactly as Jake had predicted. Bradley was looking more and more like a man who'd made a serious mistake. Seems we owe you an apology, Mr. Morgan, Bradley said reluctantly. No, I said before Jake could respond. You owe him more than that. You owe him justice. By the time we reached Silas Creek's ranch, the man had already fled, leaving behind evidence of his crimes, including drafts of the ransom note in his own handwriting. The stolen money from the stagecoach robbery was hidden in his barn, along with items that had belonged to other victims. He's been robbing travelers for months, Bradley said grimly as his men searched the premises, using your ranch as a convenient scapegoat whenever things got too hot. That night, back at Jake's ranch, we sat on the porch as we had so many evenings before, but everything had changed between us. You stood up for me, Jake said quietly, even when you thought I might actually be planning to hold you prisoner. I couldn't let them hurt you, I replied simply. Jake was silent for a long time, staring out at the star-filled sky. Your father will come for you soon, he said eventually. I know. And you'll go back to Boston. Marry that railroad prince he's picked out for you. I turned to look at him, this man who had saved my life in more ways than one. Will I? Jake met my eyes, and I saw my own feelings reflected in their green depths. Catherine, he began, but I silenced him with a finger to his lips. My father owes you a debt, I said softly. He owes you for saving his daughter's life, and for suffering false accusations because of it. I don't want his money. I know what you want, I said, my heart pounding. The question is, do you still want it? Jake stared at me for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity. Then his arms came around me, pulling me close as his mouth claimed mine in a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope and promises yet to be made. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against mine. Are you sure? He whispered. This life, it's nothing like what you're used to. It's hard and lonely and it's where my heart belongs, I finished for him. The question is, will you have me? Not as payment for a debt, but as your wife. Jake's answer was another kiss, deeper and more passionate than the first, full of all the words we didn't need to say. 3 months later, my father arrived at the ranch with a small army of men, prepared to take his wayward daughter home by force if necessary. What he found instead was a wedding in progress, with half the territory in attendance to celebrate the marriage of Catherine Ashford and Jake Morgan. Cornelius Ashford was not a man easily surprised, but the sight of his pampered daughter in a simple white dress, glowing with happiness as she exchanged vows with a cowboy, left him speechless. It was only later, during the reception, that I was able to explain everything to him. The real story of my rescue, Creek's betrayal, and my decision to stay. You're giving up everything, my father said, his voice heavy with disbelief. Your inheritance, your position in society, the life I built for you. I'm not giving up anything that matters, I replied, watching Jake laugh with some of the local ranchers. I'm choosing love over obligation, Papa. I'm choosing happiness over security. My father followed my gaze to my new husband, taking in Jake's easy smile and the way he kept glancing over at me as if to make sure I was still there. "He makes you happy?" Papa asked quietly. Deliriously so. Papa was silent for a long time, and I could see him struggling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I built that railroad to give you a better life," he said finally. I never stopped to think about the lives I was destroying in the process. It was as close to an apology as Cornelius Ashford was likely to give, and I squeezed his hand in understanding. "Build a school instead," I suggested, "here in the territory. Give these children the education they deserve." Papa's eyes widened at the suggestion, then slowly began to gleam with the same enthusiasm I'd seen whenever he talked about his business ventures. "A school," he mused. Yes, that could work." And so it was that the great railroad baron Cornelius Ashford found himself funding the territory's first proper school, with his daughter as its first teacher and his son-in-law as the man who'd taught him that some things were more valuable than money. As for Jake and me, we settled into a life that was indeed hard and sometimes lonely, but filled with a love that grew stronger with each passing day. True to his word, I did give him children, first a son we named Samuel, then twin daughters we called Hope and Grace. But the greatest gift we gave each other was the chance to become the people we were meant to be. Not the bitter, revenge-obsessed man Jake had been becoming, or the passive, dutiful daughter I'd been raised to be, but partners in every sense of the word, building a life together on the foundation of mutual respect, shared dreams, and a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Sometimes, late at night when the children were asleep and we sat together on our porch watching the stars, Jake would tease me about our unusual courtship. "I still can't believe you agreed to give me children as payment for saving your life," he'd say with that crooked smile that never failed to make my heart skip. "And I can't believe you thought I'd actually go along with it," I'd reply, snuggling closer to his warmth. "Shows what we both know about negotiating," Jake would murmur against my hair. Indeed it did. Because in the end we'd both gotten exactly what we needed, not through demands or ultimatums, but through the simple act of opening our hearts to the possibility that love could grow in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely people, in the shadow of the most outrageous circumstances. The cowboy had saved me in the desert, that much was true, but I'd saved him right back, and we'd both discovered that some debts are best paid not with children or money or obligation, but with the freely given gift of two hearts choosing to beat as one. In the end, that was the greatest plot twist of all.